out among the other periods that fall under the umbrella of classical studies because it has a lot of examples of powerful women who were able to rise to wield a significant amount of power in comparison to other periods. A large factor in this development can be credited towards the spreading influence of Christianity, which at this time was the mainstream and official religion of the empire. I know this sounds pretty backwards and impossible today, but Christianity helped spur a general increase in the rights towards women during late antiquity by bringing along a shift in the attitudes towards them. Through the church, women were able to educate themselves, take control over their own bodies, and acquire various degrees of independence for themselves. Women, in the church at least, were becoming more respected. You'll notice throughout today's presentation that Christianity plays an important role in both empresses' lives. So the two ladies I'm going to discuss today are Pulcheria and Theodora. Most people who've studied Roman history have heard about Theodora. Besides being the wife to Emperor Justinian, she's infamous throughout history for her being the Byzantine equivalent of a stripper before marrying into the imperial household. Pulcheria, on the other hand, is lesser known. If you haven't heard of her, don't be ashamed because she's not that popular. But if you have, it's probably because you took Professor Wilkinson's Antiquity course last semester. In case you were wondering, she is the virgin from today's title of the presentation. So, in summary, first I'm going to discuss the lives of each empress individually as well as their ties to Christianity, before moving on to talk about their similarities and differences, and then we'll discuss at the end to see if we can decide who was the better empress, or if that's a worthy question or not. So, Pulcheria. Pulcheria was born into royalty in 399. She was the second child of Emperor Arcadius and his wife Eudokia, a formidable woman in her own right. She was the granddaughter of Theodosius I and sister to Theodosius II. Arcadius, her father, died in 408, leaving the throne to young Theodosius II, just a child at the time. Being the eldest of her siblings, Pulcheria became their de facto leader. In 414, she was only 15 years old, but she was ready to take on the empire. To attain power, Pulcheria decided to take a public vow of virginity, forcing her three younger sisters to do the same. By doing this, Pulcheria and her sisters could never be married, thus preserving the independence of the Theodosian dynasty from politically powerful men in Constantinople who could marry them and seize power away from the family itself. So, this is the first instance that Pulcheria is using her faith and religion as a political tool, hereby to consolidate power for herself and her family and also increase her public respect. Around the same time as this vow, the first official power behind the throne, Anthemius, one of said politically powerful men that could have married them and taken control, disappears from the historical record, and Pulcheria steps into his position. Exercising a great deal of influence over her younger brother, she was given the title of Augusta, placing her on the same level as her fellow Augusti, Theodosius II, and Honorius, who was the emperor in the western half of the empire. Her bust was placed in the Senate House in Constantinople, along with the two other Augusti, signifying her importance at the time. And this is crazy because she's 15 years old. So Pulcheria's influence was immediately felt. She controlled her brother's education in academics, theology, and social graces, and she controlled the lifestyle of the imperial household, changing the way the palace was run, giving it a more monastic and ascetic feel. And she also influenced a lot of imperial religious legislation, which limited the rights of Jews and pagans. And in the matters of state, she helped select generals by herself instead of Theodosius or other men who spearhead the Persian War of 421 and 422. She also chose a wife for her younger brother, a young Athenian woman by the name of Eudokia. This is probably not her best decision, as you'll soon find out. During the Persian War, she used her faith again as a tool, this time by using her religious collections in Jerusalem to acquire a relic from Saint Stephen for Constantinople. This relic was associated with victory because Stephen comes from the Greek word Stephanos, meaning crown, as you probably know, taking Greek. And in 422, a truce was drawn between the empire and the Persians, and Pulcheria was credited by her brother with the victory due to her vows and her piety, which then places her and her family and thus the whole empire in the favor of God. Pulcheria's vow of virginity and her focus on religion allowed her to associate herself with the Virgin Mary. And this is another very important political tool here. Using her political leverage, she promoted Mary as a Theotokos, which means Mother of God. This epithet was hotly contested by the new bishop of Constantinople, a certain Nestorius. As an opponent of Pulcheria's, Nestorius tried to use his position to keep her authority at bay, because he wasn't really happy with a woman running the show for the empire. So he fought against her by depriving her of many religious privileges she had previously enjoyed, such as receiving the Eucharist among the clergy before everybody else at church services. He also tried to kibosh the epithet of Theotokos for the Virgin Mary. Pulcheria understood her connection to the Theotokos was an essential part of her public image and power, so she plotted to destroy Nestorius. She used her religious connections again, specifically Cyril, the controversial bishop of Alexandria, to organize the Third Ecumenical Council. There, Nestorius was accused of heresy, and the people of Constantinople celebrated Pulcheria's victory. Pulcheria did face some setbacks, though, namely from her estranged sister-in-law Eudokia and the politically powerful Chrysaphius. The two managed to turn Theodosius II's favor against her, and Pulcheria was driven to the suburbs of Constantinople in exile in 439. During her exile, Chrysaphius turned on Eudokia as well and forced her into exile by causing Theodosius to believe that she had cheated on him. And so he is now the sole power behind the throne. In doing this, he started to undo everything the Third Ecumenical Council had done, promoting instead the Monophysite faith over the Orthodox faith of the empire. The Monophysite faith was really popular in the East at the time, and it goes against the Nicene Orthodoxy of the empire in believing that Jesus could not have two, like a divine and a human identity. He could just have one, whereas like the Nicene Creed established that he had both at the same time. It's like a duality to him. Anyway, Chrysaphius did this because he had familiar relationships with a certain Eutyches, a controversial monophysite figure in the East. Chrysaphius caused a great deal of disharmony in the empire, and Pope Leo I in Rome begged Pulcheria specifically to go back to Theodosius and get him back on the side of orthodoxy to bring the empire together again. She returned to the imperial household in 450, and she managed to win her brother's favor back and had Chrysaphius banished. She was the power behind the throne once again. Within the first month of her return, her brother died, leaving her in control of the throne by herself. Unfortunately, in Roman society, they wouldn't accept a sole female ruler, so Pulcheria chose a military man of unremarkable birth to be her sham husband. His name was Marcian, and he agreed to her sexless marriage in exchange for the title of Augustus. So, in name, they're married, but really they don't consummate anything because her vow of virginity is still there. But now she's able to exercise her power legitimately through a man, and thus she organized the Fourth Ecumenical Council in 451 to restore orthodoxy to the East as the official faith of the empire. 2 years later, she died after living a very full life. During her lifetime, she managed to build many monasteries, churches, and hospitals, and did a lot of charity work for the poor of Constantinople. And of course, she saw to the preservation of the Eastern Church and Empire, as well as her own Theodosian dynasty. Okay, and Theodora. She was born about 100 years after the birth of Pulcheria, and she was probably her exact opposite. She came from a family of performers in Constantinople and grew up as a professional actress. Being an actress in Roman society meant that you were tainted with the social stigma of Lithuania. Because of this, historians have not been kind to her. Procarius, in his questionable secret history, portrays her as a devious sexual fiend, skilled in such performances such as undressing in front of a live audience and having trained geese eat grain off of her body. Yeah, they're pretty kinky. Despite her low social standing, Theodora eventually caught the eye of Justinian, the Emperor Justin's nephew and heir. It was apparently love at first sight for the two of them, and Justinian did everything he could to marry her. In 523, he had her uncle make her into a patrician, but this wasn't enough because they faced a great deal of protest due to archaic status-based marriage laws, and Theodora's faith. Justinian was fond of Theodora, though, and changed these laws so actresses and former actresses could marry upper-class men. But they would have had to have renounced their profession before this could happen. Anyway, 3 years later, Justinian becomes Augustus in 528, and thus Theodora becomes Augusta. Despite social stigmas against her, there was no public outcry over her marriage. Justinian's love for her was so strong that he shares some aspects of his imperial authority with Theodora. She was included in the oath of loyalty sworn by imperial magistrates. He consulted her opinion on matters of the state and allowed her to receive foreign and domestic officials by herself in her own court. Theodora was not Justinian's equal, though, and if she wanted to effect change in society, she had to get permission from her husband first. She did, though, manage to influence Justinian in a lot of matters, and her presence was felt in the empire. She saw many improvements to laws restricting women, and was an advocate for women charged with adultery. She also tried, though she failed, to eradicate prostitution from Constantinople in order to prevent young girls from living the life she had to. In his law code, Justinian extended the rights of women to control their own property and children, as well as eradicating further marriage barriers between unequal free citizens. Unfortunately, it's difficult to tell from the records that we have if Theodora had any direct influence on her husband into making these laws, or if they were just a product of the trend of increasing respect towards women at the time. One example of Theodora's influence comes from the Nika riots of 532, when Constantinople was in utter chaos due to clashes between 2 very popular factions of the chariot races, the Blues and the Greens. Justinian was prepared to flee the city because they were ready to kill him. It was pretty bad. Theodora, though, she steps in and gives a speech at court, which motivates her husband and his officers to regain control of the city, and they just slaughter everyone, but they get it back. And after the riots were quelled, Theodora and Justinian go on a rebuilding campaign, providing Constantinople with new public buildings and churches.